Nani ko lau poko I ke kaunga nau nā paliwi. E lele I tau apua ke ai kana he. O hala e nei nā puahi le ua o laniu. O pulu ia nā palai kanoe lani. O la ka aina I tau ai o la mai ka lewa mai. O la ka lehu I ka hana pono mai kai. Aloha e, aloha e, aloha e.
Aloha. I want to welcome you to our virtual Canoe Fest here at Hakipu, Kualoa, where we'll have great guest speakers discussing many of the cultures here at Kualoa with canoeing, the history of canoeing, and the culture of canoeing. We really want to welcome you to this program. Mahalo.
My name is Liko Hoe, and I come from the ahupua of Hakipu. And today I'm going to share a little bit about the ahupua that I come from, and a little bit of the connections to voyaging. For about 20 years I taught in the UH system, mostly at Windward Community College, mostly Hawaiian studies classes, and for the last about 5 to 10 years I've kind of transitioned to mostly running the Waiahole Poi factory, which does Hawaiian food and poi. One of the kind of famous stories connected to this area is the story of Kahahana, who was in Ali'i a couple of centuries ago, and one of the main kahuna whose name was Ka'opulupulu. And especially on the Kualoa side, this aina was significant in that story because it was said to be the source of the palawa pie, which is the whale teeth that are used to make the palawa, which are the symbols of authority in a traditional context. And a lot of that story is actually about that relationship between Kahahana, who was the ali'i, and Ka'opulupulu, who was the kahuna. And in a sense, the two ahupua also reflect that relationship. And so Kualoa was known to be a training grounds for the ali'i. And Hakipu is one of the traditional lands that were kind of a center for the kahuna side of Hawaiian society. And really, to me, you basically have the two main components of the Hawaiian leadership there. The ali'i side is the decision makers, so they need to make the call and put the kauoha out, the commands out. But the kahuna side are the knowledge keepers, and so ideally in a functional leadership situation, you have the decision makers and the knowledge keepers working in sync. And the story of Kahahana and Ka'opulupulu is kind of a cautionary story about what can happen when they get out of sync. And so that story is about kind of the consequences, of that rift, if you don't have knowledge connected to decision making. And of course, in a traditional context, knowledge is not separate from spirituality. So, the kahuna have all of the, what we would term today knowledge, but they also had strong connection to akua, which is the spiritual side. And really, in a traditional context, it's not two different things. You know, they're functioning together. So that's one of the, you know, the significance of this area of Oahu. Another story that's connected to the Kualoa and Hakipu area is actually the story of Haloa. And one way that's reflected in the land and the landscape is the, what you call the mo'okapu o Haloa, which is basically the ridge and kind of line of cliffs that starts from the, you know, the Ko'olau mountain range, and then all the way to Kalai Oi'o, which is the point, and you have this big kind of wall, in a sense, of cliffs, and that ridge line is sometimes referred to as kamo'okapu o Haloa, which means the kind of the line of cliffs of Haloa. And Haloa in traditional Hawaiian, moolelo was the original human being. And in the story of Haloa, he's actually the younger sibling of his older brother, who had the same name, Haloa, but was actually stillborn, and where he was born, there was the kalo plant that sprouted up from that. So you got the first kalo plant, and then his younger sibling was the first human being. So kind of that, you know, highlighting that connection between the people, the Kanaka, and you know, one of the main food sources, which is the kalo plant. So that's another thing that's connected to this aina that's, you know, significant. Another significant thing, coming back to the voyaging, you know, which we're here for the Va'a Festival virtually this year, is the connection to the voyaging tradition. And of course, you know, one of the famous navigators throughout the Pacific actually is Kaha'i. And our connection to Kaha'i here in Hakipu and in Kualoa is that Kaha'i was the first to bring the ulu plant. And when he brought the ulu plant, he planted it actually in hakipuu. And so we like to recognize that, you know, that connection to, again, both the food, you know, this time the ulu, which is an important food plant in our diet, and also that voyaging tradition, and that connection to Kaha'i and the honoring of Kaha'i even continued into more recent times. So all the way up until the time of Kamehameha, you know, the connection between this area and Kaha'i was recognized. And the way it was recognized was by lowering the sails. So whenever a canoe passed by this area, when they reached a certain point, they would take down their sails in honor of you know, that tradition and Kaha'i. And the point is actually, you know, if you're coming from the south side, going up, you know, towards the north, as soon as they could see the back of the valley in Waiahole, which is called Makawai, that was the point where they lowered their sails. So kind of right when you come into that, actually, you know, right passing Waiahole, that's the point where they would lower their sails to honor Kaha'i. So these are, you know, a few of the significant historical mo'olelo that Hakipu and Kualoa are connected to. You know, again, like pretty much all aina in Hawaii and beyond, there's many more mo'olelo, you know, that are connected to to the Aina. The story of Maui in Hawaii is also connected to this area, and one of the places that we see that connection is actually in one of the most famous chants that we still have, from our tradition, which is called the Kumulipo. It's basically a documenting of genealogy, from the very beginnings of life, all the way into it was carried in a family that included the ancestors of Liko Hoe and Kalakaua, and so they're actually the ones who took the chant from their personal family connection and had it written or transcribed in Hawaiian first, and then Liko Hoe was actually the first one to do a full translation into English. And in that chant, there's 16 sections. It's over 2,000 lines long for the whole chant, and it's broken up into these different sections called va. And in the 14th section, about half of that va is basically dedicated to Maui, who is the famous hero, of Hawaiian and Polynesian and beyond. And at the very end of that va, that section, it kind of talks of the end of Maui's life, which in pretty much all of the Maui stories, that's kind of a significant piece because he was kind of in between, Kanaka and Akua. Sometimes people would refer to him as like a demigod, kind of in between human and God. And of course, one of the separating things between the human and the God is mortality. That's the human side. And so it's kind of usually in the Maui stories, towards the end of his life, it was his attempt to gain that immortality, the Akua side. But he has that Kanaka quality to him too. And so at the end of that section of the Kumulipo, they talk about him falling, which is basically saying that he passed. And the connection to Hakipu and Kualoa is that he actually, it's described as ha'ule I hakipuu I Kualoa, which means to fall in Hakipu and Kualoa. And actually, right before that, the lines preceding it refer to I kahalu keewe, I waikane kapiko. So those are two ahupua'a a little bit further down. And then finally, ha'ule I hakipuu I Kualoa. So you have these four ahupua'a actually, in those lines they're all in this area. And basically it's kind of describing different parts. Actually, those first two parts, the ewe and the piko, are usually associated with birth and the beginnings of life. But then that last part, ha'ule I hakipuu I Kualoa, is referring to the end of like the fall, of Maui. And, one of the things that to me, is significant is that in the Kumulipo, 2,000 lines long, and this is a Hawaiian chant, but there's very few references to place and to specific places in Hawaii. And so it's kind of a significant thing that you have this reference to, of course, Maui, but the Kahalu, Waikane, Hakipu and Kualoa are both mentioned, right in that in that section. That's another historical figure, some might say a legendary figure, that's connected to this area. Yeah, I'll share a oli called Kako'oko'olau, and in that oli, there's towards the end there's a reference to Kualoa, and really, you know, I guess I don't mention Hakipu by name, but it's definitely there, you know. And the chant actually, that chant Kako'oko'olau, I wrote. I can't remember exactly what the year was, but it's around the time when I was starting to teach at Windward, around that time, and also the Hakipu Learning Center was just starting up. And basically, you know, for me, I had attended school since middle school and high school in town, and then I went to UH, you know, in Manoa for college and grad school. And my basic plan after college was to try to get closer and closer back to the Ko'olau side, you know, of the island. And so Windward, you know, community college was important part of that, and I really enjoyed teaching. And you know, a lot of my students over 20 years, you know, were from up and down the Ko'olau coast, you know, and I really enjoyed that. But I wrote that chant in that time to kind of honor the whole Ko'olau side. But you know, of course, for me, I come from a certain part of the Ko'olau side, you know, and so that's always kind of has a certain place for me, you know, when I chant that chant. And the title and some of the, you know, the beginning words of the chant Kako'oko'olau, in some ways it's a play on that word kako'o and ko'olau. You know, they both have the word ko'o in them. And basically ko'o in Hawaiian means to support. It can be like an actual, you know, walking stick that you use to keep yourself up, or you know, or something that supports. And so, you know, to me, it's a reflection of who we are as a community. You know, everybody plays a part, and everybody kind of helps to prop each other up, yeah, and ko'o each other. So that's the name of this chant, Kako'oko'olau. So I'll chant it for you guys. Kako'oko'olau ahelau kamakani kumupalia e tauhua kaua. Koa mai la hui pakaua molola ni a pua ke akani ko'oko. Mo au a kahawai ke kua hua ina wai puna ho moko I kaloi. Ho I mai ha loa kua ana kua loa. Ola I tawai ola e kua aina. Ola no e kua aina. The end of that chant, you know, talks about ola, which is life in Hawaiian. Ola no e kua aina, which means, you know, for the people of the land, the kua aina, you know, literally means like the backbone of the land. You know, is a call for us to, you know, to live ola, basically. So that's a oli that was written for this area. And the whole Ko'olau too. I don't want to forget that. Ko'olau Poko and Ko'olau Loa. Of course, you know, one side to the other. Hakipu and Kualoa have connections to voyaging from ancient times, you know, from our longer history. But in more recent history, you know, the past 40, 50 years, we've also had, you know, been very fortunate to be a part of the revival of the voyaging tradition. And of course, one of the significant things connected to that revival was the launching of hokulea in 1975. And then in 1976, you know, they did that initial voyage down to, or long distance voyage, I should say, down to Tahiti and back. And I'm not real familiar, and probably the people from PVS, and I think they have a lot of things actually on online, which I need to read again too. But I'm not exactly sure why they want to launch in Kualoa and Hakipu. So actually, the place that they chose to do the actual launching is more on the Hakipu side, rather than the Kualoa side. But but of course, even in traditional times, these two ahupua'a were very closely connected. And so when you say Kualoa, it means Hakipuu too, and vice versa. When you say Hakipu, it means Kualoa too. But in 1975, they got that beautiful footage. Luckily, it was well documented, and it's just so powerful to see that va'a, you got all the people pulling and then just kind of sliding right into the ocean, just kind of like, it was meant to be, basically. And I think, of course, it was. And hokulea, went from there over the next decades to today on that journey, which it's still on, of course, and just recently, completed the worldwide voyage and is preparing for another major voyage soon too, And I think ever since the launch of hokulea in 1975, this aina has continued to be a significant part of hokulea's history. And one of the things that I think has been really beautiful is that hokulea has often, at the end of a voyage, come back to this aina, and many of those times we've been able to be a part of the welcome back. One of the kind of significant times, all of them are significant, of course, but especially for our Ohana and the families of this place, was in 1995 when they came back to Hawaii. One of the things about that return was that the hokulea's voyages for the previous 20 years had inspired other people throughout Polynesia to build their own va'a. And by 1995, they had their va'a ready, and they were starting to train in navigation. And so there were a number of va'a that actually came from the South Pacific and came back with hokulea. And so, in that time there were over 6 or 7, I think, va'a that came. And so that, that welcome was not only hokulea, it was actually many va'a, from the south, and also some of the other Hawaiian va'a too that came. And so for that event, part of the planning was to build an oahu, which we're sitting right next to right now. And we decided to actually build it right on the boundary line between Kualoa and Hakipuu. And so it kind of marks, that the area, and gives people a little bit of a visual of, okay, this is the ahupua'a of Hakipuu, this is the ahupua'a of Kualoa. And it was a beautiful event. It was an opportunity for our Ohana to gather and to help to host and to welcome, not only hokulea at that time, but other va'a from throughout the Pacific. And 95, I was just finishing up my bachelor's at UH. I studied Hawaiian language. And so I was part of the organizing, of that event. And one of the things that I contribute to that was to compose an oli that we use to welcome each of the va'a. And it's really a very short oli that I call oli komo. And basically the lines are very simple. It just says iwi o ku'iwi, which means the bones of my bones. Eo, which is just saying to kind of recognize, and it's a call and response oli. So one person, the leader, will call out iwi o ku'iwi, and the group will answer eo, to kind of recognize that connection. The next line is koko ku'ukoko, which means the blood of my blood, and the response is the same, eo. And then the last two lines are pilika mo'o, which the leader will call out, and everybody answers a mauloa. Pilika mo'o just means, pili means to be connected or close to, and kamo'o, mo'o, earlier we talked about the mo'o kapu haloa, which is like the line of cliffs. We also have the word moolelo, which is like literally it's kind of like the line of words, and we use it means like history. Mo'oku auhau is the word for genealogy. So that word mo'o always means like a line of things that are connected, lineage in a sense, yeah. And so that line pilika mo'o means that our stories, our lineage, our genealogies, our history is connected. And then the last line, which everybody comes in on, is amauloa, which means, in a sense, once it's connected, which it is already, that's forever. That connection is continual. And so, I wrote that oli, that we could use as a welcome to everybody, and basically the main theme, is that we're all connected, throughout Polynesia, but as hokulea has shown, and we already know, there's no separation between Polynesia and Melanesia and Micronesia. Yeah, there's no actual line. I mean, we kind of draw lines on the map, but there's really no separation. We're all connected. And, once you go to Micronesia and Melanesia, you're in Indonesia, and pretty soon you're in India, and pretty soon you're in Africa and Europe, and, really those connections, I think, and hokulea has highlighted that, and I think expressed that in a very powerful way, in that they went all the way around and connected that physically with everybody, and I think that's a beautiful thing. One of these days, in this last return home from the worldwide voyage, my older brother Kala, who is gifted artist and sculptor, created a sculpture using stone. It's big. It's like I think it's maybe about 4 or 5 feet tall and kind of round, and it commemorated that voyage around the world. And it's a really beautiful, and I think part of the discussion is to maybe have it installed somewhere here in the park eventually. I think right now it's at Kualoa Ranch area, but I think that would be really beautiful to create a space for it to kind of be another recognition of that that connection. Again, both from the history, the moolelo, but just last year, 2017, when they came back, And then they're planning into the future, yeah. That voyage is continued to.
Aloha! I want to welcome you here to Kualoa Regional Park. I want to talk to you a little bit about our program, our Ocean Rec program. It's a great program where we reach out to the children of Oahu. We teach the kids many things. We teach them how to paddle canoe. We teach them how to sail canoe. We teach them the makahiki games. It's a great place for them to learn the culture of Oahu. This place is a very sacred place, Kualoa. It's a wonderful place. It's a beautiful place where the kids can get in touch with their culture, their ancestry, and the aloha spirit that runs through all of us.